July 16th, 1999, a Friday evening in New Jersey. A small Piper Saratoga aircraft sits on the tarmac at Essex County Airport. The air is hazy, not stormy, not dramatic, just the particular kind of summer murk that makes experienced pilots pause and inexperienced ones press forward. John F. Kennedy Jr. is doing the pre-flight check. His wife, Carolyn, is already on board, and beside her, settling into the rear seat with the quiet efficiency of someone who has learned to take up the right amount of space and no more, is Carolyn Bessette. She is 34 years old. She is a vice president at Morgan Stanley. She has a life in New York that her colleagues describe, in the accounts that will come later, as disciplined, warm, and almost aggressively private. She is flying to Martha's Vineyard for the weekend, partly to attend a cousin's wedding with Carolyn, partly because her sister asked her to come. That is nearly everything the public record offers about Carolyn Bessette on the last evening of her life. What it offers about the hours that follow fills thousands of newspaper columns, but almost none of them are about her. This is a story that has been told many times. The Kennedy name guarantees that. But it has almost never been told from Lauren's direction, from the particular angle of a woman who was accomplished, visible in her own professional world, loved by people who knew her, without the benefit of a famous last name, and who died in one of the most covered news events of the decade without ever, in the coverage, becoming its subject. What follows is an attempt to look directly at Carolyn Bessette, not at who she stood beside, not at the tragedy as it was consumed by a grieving public, but at the life that preceded the night, at the pressures that shaped it, the choices that defined it, and the particular kind of invisibility that can settle over a person even while the flashbulbs are going off all around them. Greenwich, Connecticut is not a place that announces itself. There are no billboards at the town line. The wealth there does not perform. It simply exists, in the setback of houses from the road, in the particular quietness of the streets, in the way the schools operate as though the question of whether their students will succeed has already been settled, and the only remaining matter is by how much. Carolyn Bessette was born in 1964 into a family that lived inside that world, but not entirely at its center. Her father, William Bessette, worked in insurance. Her mother, Anne, would later remarry a man named Richard Freeman. And the household Lauren grew up in was comfortable, educated, and oriented entirely around the idea that achievement was the primary language through which a person proved their worth. This was not unusual in Greenwich. It was, in many ways, the founding premise of the place. The Bessette children, Lauren, Carolyn, and their older sister Lisa, grew up in a house where expectations were high and largely unspoken. No one needed to say that success mattered. The town said it. The schools said it. The other families on the street said it, not in words, but in the steady accumulation of accomplishments that got mentioned at dinners and written into college recommendation letters, and displayed with careful casualness in conversations between parents who were keeping score without admitting to keeping score. Lauren was a good student. She was organized, focused, and possessed of the kind of steady intelligence that teachers appreciated and peers sometimes found difficult to categorize. She was not the kind of girl who dominated a room. She was not the kind of girl who needed to. She learned early that competence was its own form of presence, that if you did the work thoroughly enough, if you prepared more carefully than anyone else expected you to, you earned a kind of respect that did not require performance. What she could not control, and what Greenwich made it difficult to ignore, was Carolyn. Carolyn Bessette was 3 years younger and operated according to an entirely different set of laws. Where Lauren was precise, Carolyn was instinctive. Where Lauren built her presence through effort, Carolyn simply had presence. The kind that caused people to look up when she walked into a room without being able to say exactly why. She was beautiful in a way that Greenwich girls were often trained to manage and downplay, but Carolyn did not downplay it. She wore it with a kind of ease that unsettled people who thought beauty was supposed to come with apology attached. Growing up alongside that is not a simple thing. It is not, in any clean way, a painful thing either. Lauren and Carolyn were close, by all accounts that emerge later from people who knew them both, genuinely close with the particular bond of sisters who understood each other's private language. But closeness does not eliminate comparison. And in a town like Greenwich, in a household oriented around achievement and appearance both, comparison was the medium through which identity got formed. Lauren went to St. Mary's School and then on to Wake Forest University in North Carolina, where she studied business. The choice was deliberate and revealing. She was not pursuing something abstract or exploratory. She was pursuing something with a clear structure, a clear metric of success, a clear path from effort to outcome. Business rewarded the things she was good at: precision, analysis, preparation, the willingness to work longer than the person next to you without making a production of it. At Wake Forest, she distinguished herself academically and began to develop the professional manner that would later serve her on Wall Street. Composed, direct, careful with her words in a way that read as confidence rather than caution. She made friends who described her as loyal to the point of intensity, someone who, once she decided you mattered to her, treated that decision as permanent. She did not accumulate acquaintances. She collected people she trusted and held them close. What Wake Forest also gave her, for the first time, was distance from Greenwich. Distance from the particular social arithmetic of that town, from the comparisons that were never stated but always present, from the feeling of being measured against a sister whose gifts operated in a completely different register than her own. In North Carolina, she was simply Lauren Bessette, not Lauren, Carolyn's older sister. Not Lauren, the one who is more serious. Just Lauren, who was sharp and reliable and worth knowing. She returned to that uncomplicated version of herself with something like relief. But Greenwich had already done its work. The habits of mind it installed, the vigilance about performance, the awareness of how one appeared relative to others, the understanding that comfort was conditional on continued achievement. Those did not dissolve with distance. They traveled with her. They would continue to travel with her through the subsequent decades, shaping the choices she made about work, about relationships, about how much of herself to offer, and to whom. There is a particular kind of person that environments like Greenwich produce. Not villains, not victims, but individuals for whom the internal pressure gauge is set permanently higher than it needs to be. People who have absorbed the message that rest is risk, that visibility requires justification, that the safest way to exist in a world that is always evaluating you is to give it no grounds for a negative verdict. Lauren Bessette was that kind of person. She had earned that disposition honestly, through years of living in a place that did not know how to value what it could not measure. She graduated from Wake Forest in 1986 and moved to New York. The city absorbed her quickly, the way it absorbs everyone who arrives with something to prove and the discipline to prove it. She was 22 years old. She had a degree, a direction, and the specific kind of confidence that comes not from ease, but from having prepared for nearly everything. What she had not prepared for, what Greenwich, for all its pressure, had not equipped her for, was what happened when the work was done and the apartment was quiet, and there was no next assignment waiting, no metric to meet, no way to make herself legible to the world that did not involve performing competence for an audience that was no longer watching. That was a problem for later. For now, there was New York, there was the future, there was the particular intoxication of a city that rewarded exactly the qualities she had spent her whole life developing. She walked into it without hesitation. Carolyn Bessette arrived in New York in the late 1980s, and the city responded to her the way cities respond to very few people, immediately and without reservation. She had studied education at Boston University, which surprised people who met her later because nothing about the way she moved through a room suggested someone who had chosen a quiet, service-oriented profession. She was working in public relations by the time Lauren was already established in finance, and then she landed at Calvin Klein, first on the floor of the flagship store, and then, with a speed that her colleagues attributed partly to talent and partly to something less quantifiable, in a role managing press relations for the brand. Calvin Klein in the early 1990s was not simply a fashion label. It was a cultural force, provocative, precise, obsessed with a particular vision of American beauty that Carolyn embodied so completely. It was sometimes difficult to tell where the brand ended and she began. Lauren watched this from a specific distance. She was living in New York, too, working at Morgan Stanley, building the kind of career that required total commitment and rewarded it with a title, a salary, and the respect of people who understood what it meant to survive in that environment. She and Carolyn saw each other regularly. They were sisters in the active sense, not just in blood but in practice, in phone calls and dinners, and the particular shorthand that develops between people who have shared a childhood and come out the other side, still choosing each other. But the city was doing something to their respective positions that Greenwich had only begun. In Greenwich, the comparison between them had been social, familial, conducted in the relatively contained theater of a wealthy suburb where everyone knew everyone, and the stakes, while felt intensely, were ultimately local. In New York, the stakes were different. New York had photographers. New York had gossip columns. New York had the particular machinery of fame that once it fixes on a person, does not release them. And by the early 1990s, that machinery had fixed on Carolyn Bessette with an attention that Lauren could observe but not participate in, and could not, without betraying something she preferred not to examine, entirely ignore. This is not to say Lauren was envious in any simple or consuming way. The people who knew her from that period describe someone who was proud of Carolyn, who spoke about her sister with genuine warmth, who did not traffic in the resentment that might have been understandable given the circumstances. But pride and discomfort are not mutually exclusive. A person can be genuinely glad for someone they love and still feel, in the moments when they are alone and the apartment is quiet, the particular weight of standing in a light that is always slightly warmer somewhere else. What made it more complicated was that the comparison was not one Carolyn invited or engineered. She did not position herself against Lauren. She did not, by any account, diminish her sister or treat her own visibility as something to be leveraged within the family. The dynamic was produced not by anything either of them did, but by the world's indifference to women who achieve through discipline rather than magnetism. Lauren had built something real. She was building it carefully and without shortcuts, but the world was not watching. The world was watching Carolyn. And then John F. Kennedy Jr. walked into a Calvin Klein event in 1992, and the machinery accelerated to a speed that neither sister could have fully anticipated. Kennedy was, by that point, the single most famous eligible bachelor in the country, a status he had held involuntarily for most of his adult life. He was handsome in the way his father had been handsome, which meant the press treated his appearance as a matter of public interest. He was also, by most accounts from people who knew him, genuinely charming and more self-aware about his position than the coverage suggested. He and Carolyn began what would become a years-long relationship. Intense, volatile by some accounts, conducted almost entirely in public, even when they wanted it to be private. Lauren watched her younger sister navigate something that had no instruction manual. There was no guidebook for becoming the romantic partner of an American political dynasty's last surviving son. There was no way to prepare for the particular invasion that came with it. The photographers outside restaurants, the speculation in gossip columns, the sense that your private life had been declared public property by forces entirely outside your control. What Lauren observed in the years between the beginning of that relationship and the wedding in 1996 was the specific cost of that kind of visibility on a person who had not, regardless of her poise, asked to become a symbol. Carolyn was being watched and discussed and analyzed in ways that had almost nothing to do with who she actually was. She was being projected onto. The press constructed a version of her, cool, imperious, effortlessly stylish, that drew on real qualities but flattened them into a character rather than a person. And Lauren, who knew the person rather than the character, could see the gap between them widening. There is something particular about watching someone you love be misunderstood at scale. It produces a kind of protective alertness, a heightened attention to the ways the public narrative diverges from the private reality. And it also produces, in a person already inclined toward privacy, a deepened conviction that exposure is dangerous, that the world's attention is not a gift, but an imposition, that the safest version of a life is one conducted below the threshold of that kind of interest. Lauren drew closer to that conviction through those years. She worked, she maintained her friendships with the care she brought to everything. She was present for Carolyn in the ways a sister can be present, practically quietly, without making her support into a performance. But something was also consolidating inside her during this period. A sense that her own life, the one she was building through effort and discipline, and the refusal to rely on anything she had not earned, was increasingly difficult to make legible to a world that had decided the only Bessette sister worth looking at was the one standing next to a Kennedy. She did not say this. She was not the kind of person who said things like that. She returned to work on Monday morning the way she always did, prepared and composed and ready. Wall Street in the late 1980s and early 1990s was not a place that had thought carefully about what it wanted from women. It had thought carefully about what it wanted from people: aggression, endurance, a tolerance for humiliation dressed up as mentorship, and an absolute willingness to subordinate every other dimension of life to the demands of the work. And it had simply assumed, without examining the assumption, that women who wanted to participate would adapt to those conditions or remove themselves. Lauren Bessette did not remove herself. She joined Morgan Stanley in the years following her graduation from Wake Forest and entered an environment that was, by the standards of the financial industry at that time, prestigious and punishing in equal measure. Morgan Stanley occupied a particular position in the hierarchy of Wall Street firms. Not the most aggressive, not the most reckless, but serious in a way that attracted a certain kind of person and then tested, through years of sustained pressure, whether that seriousness was real or performed. The work was in mergers and acquisitions, in the specific and demanding business of advising corporations on how to buy other corporations, how to structure those purchases, how to present them to boards and regulators and shareholders in ways that made the inevitable disruption seem not just tolerable, but desirable. It was detailed work. It was unglamorous work, in the sense that the glamour existed only in the outcome. The deal announced, the transaction closed, and the years of preparation that preceded it were conducted in conference rooms and over spreadsheets and in phone calls at hours that suggested the people making them had no other obligations in the world. Lauren was suited to it. The discipline she had developed in Greenwich, the precision she had cultivated at Wake Forest, the capacity for sustained effort without external validation, all of it found a context in which it was not just useful, but essential. She was good at the work. This is documented not in any formal record, but in the trajectory. The promotions that came steadily, the accounts she was trusted with, the eventual title of vice president that she held by the late 1990s. Vice president at Morgan Stanley in that era was not a courtesy title. It was a designation earned through years of demonstrated competence in an environment that did not extend courtesy to anyone. But the environment also did not extend belonging. The culture of a firm like Morgan Stanley in the early 1990s was built by men for men, not through explicit design, but through the accumulated weight of 1,000 small decisions, 1,000 casual assumptions, 1,000 moments in which the default human being in any given scenario was understood to be male. Women who succeeded in that environment did so by learning to navigate a set of unwritten rules that were never explained because they were never acknowledged. You dressed a certain way, conservative, serious, nothing that invited commentary. You spoke in meetings at the right moments and not the wrong ones. You absorbed criticism without visible reaction and offered it when you had to offer it, with a precision that could not be mistaken for emotion. You worked harder than the men around you and presented that work with less self-promotion, because self-promotion in a woman read in that room at that time as something the room had a word for that was not complimentary. Lauren navigated all of this. She was, by the accounts of people who worked alongside her, exceptionally good at the navigation. Not because she was performing a role, but because the qualities required were ones she had already developed for other reasons. The composure was real. The precision was real. The capacity to absorb pressure without externalizing it was something she had been practicing since Greenwich, since the years of being evaluated and found competent and still somehow not quite sufficient. What the navigation cost her is harder to document because the costs of that kind of sustained self-regulation rarely appear in any record. They appear instead in the texture of a life, in what gets postponed, in what gets decided is not worth pursuing, in the gradual narrowing of the space a person allows themselves to occupy outside of work. She was in her late 20s and then her early 30s, and the personal life that she might have built alongside the professional one was being deferred with the same efficiency she brought to everything else. This was not unusual on Wall Street. The culture actively discouraged the kind of presence required to maintain relationships outside the office. The hours were structured in a way that made anything else, romantic partnership, close friendship, the ordinary maintenance of a life that had texture beyond spreadsheets, feel like a luxury that serious people did not indulge. Lauren told herself the way people in that environment tell themselves that there would be time later, that the work came first now because the work had to come first now, and that the rest of it, whatever the rest of it was, would arrange itself once the professional foundation was solid enough to build on. The foundation kept requiring more work. There were relationships during these years. The details of them are not part of any public record, which is itself a form of information. Lauren did not allow her personal life to become visible in the way that the culture of New York in the 1990s made possible if you wanted it to be. She was not someone who processed privately in public. What she felt in rooms that were not being observed. What her colleagues saw was a woman who arrived prepared, who stayed late when the work required it, who treated the people below her on the hierarchy with a consistency and fairness that was not universal in that environment. She was demanding, but not cruel. She expected from her team what she expected from herself, which was a great deal. But she did not confuse harshness with rigor the way some of her peers did. She was, in the specific and limited vocabulary that Wall Street makes available for describing people it respects, a professional. The word was meant as a compliment. It was also, in the way it was applied to women in that environment, a subtle erasure, a way of acknowledging competence while declining to acknowledge the full human being behind it. Lauren accepted the compliment. She had learned long before Wall Street that accepting what was offered without demanding what was withheld was simply the price of operating in rooms that had not been built with her in mind. She kept working. The titles accumulated. The accounts grew larger. By the mid-1990s, Carolyn Bessette had achieved, by almost any external measure, exactly what she had set out to achieve. She had a title at one of the most respected financial institutions in the country. She had an apartment in New York. She had a salary that placed her comfortably inside the upper tier of a city that sorted people by income, with the same casual efficiency it sorted them by neighborhood. She had the respect of colleagues who did not give respect easily and did not, once given, retract it without cause. She was 30 years old, and then 31, and then 32. The work continued, the apartment continued, the city continued around her, with its particular indifference to the interior lives of the people moving through it. What the external record does not show, what external records almost never show, is the growing distance between the life she had built and the life she had perhaps imagined building when she was still at Wake Forest, still at the stage where the future was a space to be filled rather than a structure already under construction. At 32, the structure was real and solid, and, in certain lights, impressive. It was also in ways she did not discuss with colleagues and discussed with friends, only in the oblique language people use when they are not ready to be direct about something. Not quite what she had meant. The relationships she had deferred in her late 20s had not, as she had told herself they would, arranged themselves. The deferral had become a habit, and habits, once established in a personality as disciplined as Lauren's, are difficult to distinguish from decisions. The question of whether she was choosing to prioritize work or simply continuing to do what she had always done because it was what she knew how to do was not one she spent visible time examining. She was not given to public self-examination, she was given to forward motion. But forward motion requires a direction. And by the mid-1990s, the direction was less clear than it had been when she was 22, and the goal was simply to prove she could survive Wall Street. She had proven it. She had done more than survive. And the question of what came after proving the thing you set out to prove is one that the culture she inhabited, Greenwich, Morgan Stanley, the specific world of New York finance in that era, had no mechanism for addressing. The culture knew how to produce achievement. It did not know what to do with the person who achieved and then looked up from the work and found the room quieter than expected. The friendships she maintained from this period are described by the people who held them as meaningful and real but conducted within strict boundaries. Lauren was loyal. She was present. She remembered things, birthdays, the details of problems people had mentioned months earlier, the particular concerns of people she cared about, with the same precision she brought to client files. But she kept a layer of herself in reserve, not from coldness, from a disposition toward privacy that had been formed so early and reinforced so consistently that she may not have experienced it as a choice at all. The people who loved her accepted this. They understood, in the way that people who know someone well understand things that are never stated, that full access was not something Lauren offered, and that what she did offer, the loyalty, the attentiveness, the absolute reliability, was not a partial version of herself, but simply the version she knew how to give. What existed behind the reserve is harder to know. The few accounts that surface, from friends speaking years later, from colleagues who noticed things they did not remark on at the time, suggest someone who was, in the private moments, warmer and more uncertain than the professional surface indicated. Someone who wanted things she did not allow herself to want openly. Someone who had absorbed, perhaps too completely, the lesson that need was a vulnerability, and vulnerability was a risk. The apartment she lived in during this period was, by accounts of people who visited it, neat and considered. Not the apartment of someone who had simply accumulated things, but of someone who had made deliberate choices about what to allow into her space. There were books, there were objects that mattered to her. The overall impression was of a life that had been curated with the same attention she brought to her work, which meant it was impressive and functional, and in some quality that visitors sometimes struggled to articulate, slightly airless. She traveled when the work allowed it. She was a capable traveler, organized, adaptable, someone who did not require comfort to be comfortable. She went to places that interested her rather than places that were fashionable, which was consistent with a broader pattern of preferring substance to visibility. She brought back nothing that she didn't genuinely want. She told no one more than she wanted to tell. Carolyn's world, by contrast, was becoming increasingly impossible to control. The relationship with Kennedy had deepened and destabilized and deepened again through the early 1990s. And by 1995 and 1996, it was being conducted under a level of press scrutiny that had begun to affect Carolyn in ways Lauren could see but not remedy. Carolyn had lost weight. She was, in the accounts of people close to her, oscillating between a public composure that was costing her considerably and a private exhaustion that she could not always contain. Lauren was present for this. She was the person Carolyn called. She was the person who showed up when showing up was what was needed, without being asked and without making her presence into something that required acknowledgement. This is what she knew how to do: to be useful, to be reliable, to manage the practical and emotional logistics of a crisis with the same efficiency she managed everything else. What it required of her: the sustained attention to her sister's increasingly difficult circumstances while managing her own demanding professional life, while maintaining the friendship she had, while continuing to defer the personal life that kept not quite materializing, was considerable. She absorbed it without complaint. She had a high threshold for what she allowed to show. The work continued, the appointments filled, the weeks accumulated into months, the months into years, and the life she was living was full in every measurable dimension and quiet in the one dimension that measurements cannot reach. The wedding happened on September 21st, 1996, on Cumberland Island, Georgia, a place chosen specifically because it was difficult to reach, which was the point. John F. Kennedy Jr. and Carolyn Bessette married in a small wooden church called First African Baptist, built by freed slaves in the 1890s, in a ceremony attended by fewer than 40 people. The secrecy was not romantic whimsy, it was logistics. The press had been circling the relationship for years, and Kennedy and Carolyn had learned, through sustained and unwilling experience, that any advance information about their movements would produce a situation they could not control. Lauren was there. She was one of the 40. The photographs that eventually emerged, because photographs always eventually emerged, show Carolyn in a slip dress designed by Narciso Rodriguez, pale and precise, her hair pulled back with a simplicity that fashion writers would analyze for years afterward, as though it contained a code. They show Kennedy in a dark suit, looking as he always looked in photographs, like someone who had been placed there by a casting director rather than by ordinary circumstance. They show the small group of family and friends arranged in the darkness of the island evening, holding candles. Lauren appears in some of these photographs. She is standing close to her sister. She is composed, as she is always composed. In the images, she looks like exactly what she was, a person who matters in this moment, to the people in this room, and who will not be the subject of the caption. The caption, in every publication that ran the photographs, was about Carolyn's dress. What the wedding inaugurated for Lauren was a new set of social coordinates. She was now the sister-in-law of John F. Kennedy, Jr., which meant she was adjacent to something that the country treated as public property. The Kennedy family was not simply a family, it was an institution, a mythology, an ongoing national narrative that had been running since 1960, and that showed no sign of concluding. To be pulled into its orbit, even peripherally, even as a secondary figure, was to be subject to a set of forces that had nothing to do with who you actually were. The access was real. Lauren moved, in the years following the wedding, through rooms she would not otherwise have entered. Kennedy events, Kennedy circles, the particular social world of people who were either old money or new fame or both, who gathered in the kinds of spaces that were not listed anywhere and where the conversations operated according to rules that were understood without being stated. Lauren was present in these rooms as Carolyn's sister, which was also Kennedy's sister-in-law, which gave her a position in the hierarchy that was both elevated and entirely dependent on a connection she had not made herself. This is a specific kind of social position, and it produces a specific kind of internal weather. Lauren had spent her entire professional life building something that was hers, earned through her own effort, dependent on her own competence, removable only if she stopped performing at the level that had produced it. The Kennedy adjacency was different. It could not be earned. It could only be inherited by association, and it could be removed at any moment by forces entirely outside her control. If the marriage ended, the access ended. If something happened to Kennedy, the access ended. The position was structurally identical to the one she had worked her whole career to avoid. Contingent, exterior, belonging to someone else. She did not, to any account's knowledge, discuss this openly. She moved through those rooms with the composure she brought to all rooms, and she was, by the reports of people who encountered her in Kennedy's social circles, warm and direct, and notably unbothered by the grandeur that seemed to affect other people in the vicinity. She did not perform deference to the Kennedy name. She did not, on the other end, perform indifference to it. She simply continued to be Lauren, attentive, measured, interested in the actual people rather than the social position they represented. But the orbit had its own gravity, and gravity does not ask permission. The press, which had been following Carolyn and Kennedy since before the wedding, now had a larger cast of characters to track. Lauren appeared in gossip columns not as herself, but as a supporting figure, identified by her relation to Carolyn, described in terms of the Kennedy social world rather than her own. Her career was occasionally mentioned, usually in a single clause. Carolyn Bessette, a vice president at Morgan Stanley. It was accurate. It was also, in the context of the coverage, entirely decorative. A credential appended to a name that was itself appended to the names that actually mattered to the publication running the item. She continued to go to work. The Morgan Stanley identity, the one she had built herself, that existed independent of any marriage or family connection or famous name, remained the center of her daily life. The Kennedy world was evenings and weekends, a social reality that coexisted with but did not replace the professional one. She kept the two separate with a care that was probably deliberate, though she never said so. What the orbit also gave her was a closer view of what fame did to her sister. Carolyn and Kennedy had been photographed fighting on a street in New York in early 1996 before the wedding, a moment that the tabloids reproduced extensively, and that Carolyn could not undo or contextualize or respond to without making it worse. After the wedding, the surveillance intensified rather than diminished. Carolyn could not leave their apartment in Tribeca without being photographed. She could not go to a restaurant or a friend's apartment or a hair salon without the possibility of a lens finding her. The person the press had constructed from those photographs, remote, stylish, possibly unhappy, was becoming a character that Carolyn was required to inhabit in public, even as it diverged further and further from whatever she actually was in private. Lauren watched this with the attentiveness she brought to everything she cared about. She watched her sister navigate a situation for which there was no navigation manual, watched the toll it took in ways that were visible only if you knew what to look for, watched the gap between the public Carolyn and the private one widen into something that was genuinely difficult to bridge. She was close enough to see all of it. She was not in a position to stop any of it. The apartment at 20 North Moore Street in Tribeca was a converted warehouse space. Large, open plan, the kind of New York apartment that gets described in real estate listings as a loft and in magazine profiles as a sanctuary. Kennedy had lived there before the marriage. Carolyn moved in after the wedding and began, by the accounts of people who visited, the slow process of making it into something that felt like a shared life rather than a bachelor's space that had been joined by a wife. It was never entirely comfortable. This is not a judgment on either of them. It is simply what the people who knew them, friends, family members, the handful of journalists who got close enough over the years to observe rather than simply report, described in the years that followed. The marriage was real. The feeling between them was real. And the conditions under which they were attempting to build a private life were conditions that would have tested any two people, regardless of how well suited they were. Kennedy was the editor of George, the political magazine he had founded in 1995, which absorbed enormous amounts of his energy and produced in him a specific kind of stress. The stress of someone who has staked his public identity on a venture that the people around him are not entirely certain will succeed. The magazine was interesting and sometimes excellent and consistently underfunded, and perpetually in the position of having to justify its existence to people who thought Kennedy should be doing something more obviously serious with the fame he had inherited. He was also, by several accounts from people who knew him well, someone who struggled with the weight of what his name meant, who had spent his entire life being publicly defined by a loss that occurred when he was 3 years old, and who had developed, as a response to that, a particular need for lightness, for humor, for the specific relief of moments when nobody was thinking about his father. Carolyn was not light in that sense. She was sharp and funny, and capable of warmth that surprised people who had only encountered the composed public version of her. But she was also someone who felt things intensely, who was not equipped by temperament to treat the surveillance and speculation as background noise, who needed from her marriage a privacy and a stability that the circumstances of the marriage made nearly impossible to provide. The volatility between them was documented not by their own words. Neither of them gave interviews about the marriage, but by the photographs that appeared in tabloids throughout 1997 and 1998. Images of disagreements on sidewalks, images of Carolyn leaving the building alone, or arriving alone, or standing outside the apartment in a way that suggested the inside of it was not somewhere she wanted to be at that particular moment. The tabloids presented these images as evidence of a marriage in crisis, which served the tabloids' purposes, but the images themselves were simply moments, excerpts from a continuous and private experience that the camera had interrupted without context. Lauren was inside that context. She knew the version of events that did not appear in the tabloids. The specific textures of the difficulty, the particular shape of the distance that was developing between Carolyn and Kennedy, the ways in which two people who cared about each other were failing in those years to translate that care into the ordinary stability that a marriage requires to survive. She was the person Carolyn called. This is consistent across multiple accounts from people who knew both sisters. That Lauren was Carolyn's primary confidant in this period, the person to whom Carolyn spoke most directly about what was happening inside the marriage. What Carolyn told her is not documented anywhere, because Lauren did not repeat it to anyone who recorded it, which is entirely consistent with what everyone who knew Lauren says about her. She kept what was told to her. She did not process in public. What this meant in practical terms was that Lauren was carrying through the late 1990s a significant amount of information and emotional weight that she could not set down anywhere. She knew things about her sister's marriage that she could not discuss with colleagues, could not process with casual friends, could not address publicly without betraying the confidence of someone she loved. She held it the way she held everything, privately, efficiently, without visible strain. The strain was there. It is visible in retrospect, in the accounts of people who saw her during those years and noticed something that they did not, at the time, have language for. A quality of attention that was sometimes slightly elsewhere, a care in choosing her words that was even more pronounced than usual, a tendency, in social situations, to be entirely present and yet somehow also in the middle of something she was not going to mention. She was at the same time watching Carolyn's health and well-being in ways that went beyond the ordinary concern of a sister. Carolyn had become thinner in the years since the wedding, visibly in ways that were commented on by the press with the particular cruelty that the press of that era reserved for women's bodies, treating the change as either a fashion statement or evidence of personal dysfunction, without considering that it might be evidence of a person under sustained and extraordinary pressure. Lauren noticed. She was not in a position to fix it. She could be present, and she was present, but presence has limits. The marriage did not end. That is perhaps the most important thing to understand about this period, that Carolyn and Kennedy did not divorce, did not separate in any formal way, continued to live together and be photographed together and be described in the press as a couple, even as the interior of that coupling was something the press could not access and could only guess at. They were working on it. This is what the people who knew them in 1998 and early 1999 describe. Two people who had not given up, who were in therapy together, who were making the kind of effortful attempts that require you to believe the thing you are attempting is worth the effort. Lauren wanted it to work. She wanted it with the particular intensity of someone who knew enough about the situation to understand what was at stake. Not the public version of what was at stake, the Kennedy name, the magazine covers, the historical significance, but the private version, her sister's daily life, her sister's capacity to be okay. She kept showing up. She kept answering the phone. She kept being the person Carolyn could call at any hour. There is a specific social phenomenon that occurs around famous people, and it is so common and so rarely examined that it has almost become invisible. People who are adjacent to fame, not famous themselves, but close enough to the center of attention to feel its warmth, begin to find that their social relationships reorganize themselves around that proximity. New people appear. Old relationships develop new textures. Invitations arrive that would not have arrived before. Doors open that were previously closed, and the people standing behind those doors are friendly and interested and asking questions that are slightly more specific than the questions ordinary acquaintances ask. Carolyn Bessette was not naive. She had spent a decade on Wall Street in an environment that ran on transactional relationships, and where the distinction between genuine interest and instrumental interest was something you learned to identify quickly or paid for not identifying quickly enough. She understood the currency she now carried. She understood that some portion of the attention directed at her since Carolyn's marriage was directed not at her, but at what she represented, a point of access, however indirect, to a world that other people wanted to be inside. She managed this with the same composure she managed everything. She was warm, but not open. She was sociable, but not revealing. She gave people enough to feel that they had connected with her without giving them the thing they were sometimes actually looking for, which was information or access or the particular social credential of being able to say that you knew the Kennedys, even peripherally, even by 2 degrees. But managing it takes energy, and energy spent on management is energy not spent on something else. The social world she moved through in the late 1990s was a specific stratum of New York, wealthy, connected, operating at the intersection of finance and media, and the particular kind of old money social life that Manhattan maintained alongside and slightly above its newer, louder iterations. These were dinners in apartments with good art on the walls, gatherings at houses in the Hamptons or on the Vineyard, events that were not publicized because the people attending them did not need publicity, and in many cases actively preferred its absence. Lauren had always had access to parts of this world through her own career. The Kennedy connection amplified that access considerably. She was present in these rooms as herself, as Lauren Bessette, vice president at Morgan Stanley, someone with her own views and her own professional standing, and also as something more than herself, or rather as something adjacent to a fame that she had not chosen and could not fully control. The two identities coexisted uneasily. She could not always tell, in any given conversation, whether she was being engaged for who she was or for what she was connected to, and the uncertainty produced in her a vigilance that sat just below the surface of her composure. The professional world remained the space where this uncertainty was least present. At Morgan Stanley, she was simply and entirely herself. Her position was based on what she had done, what she knew, what she could deliver. The Kennedy name was not relevant there in any direct way. It might have produced in a handful of colleagues a slightly heightened awareness of her social coordinates, but the work did not care about social coordinates. The work cared about whether you had prepared adequately and whether your analysis was correct and whether the client trusted you. On those terms, Lauren stood entirely on her own ground. This is part of why she continued to treat the work as primary, not simply because she was professionally ambitious, though she was, but because it was the one context in which the currency of proximity had no value. She was not Kennedy's sister-in-law at Morgan Stanley. She was Lauren Bessette, and that was enough, and it was hers. The social realm was more complicated. She attended events she would not have attended before 1996. She met people she would not otherwise have met. Some of these people became genuinely important to her. Friends formed in those years who remained present in her life and who describe her, in the retrospective accounts that exist, as someone who distinguished clearly between the people she was performing social function with and the people she actually wanted to be in a room with. But the performing of social function was a real part of her life in those years, and it was a part that she could not easily step back from without stepping back from Carolyn, which she was not willing to do. To be fully present for her sister meant being present in her sister's world, and her sister's world now included dimensions. The Kennedy social obligations, the public appearances, the particular demands of being attached to a name that came with its own infrastructure. That Lauren navigated not because she had chosen them, but because they came with the person she loved. There were specific moments in this period that the partial record captures. A charity event in 1997 at which Lauren appeared alongside Carolyn and Kennedy and was photographed, and the photograph ran in a society column with a caption that identified her as Carolyn's sister and noted her Morgan Stanley position in the parenthetical. A Hamptons gathering in the summer of 1998 that mutual friends of both sisters have described in later interviews as one of the last times the three of them, Lauren, Carolyn, Kennedy, seemed genuinely relaxed together. A dinner in the city, winter of that same year, that Carolyn called Lauren about afterward, not to report what had happened, but simply, it seemed, to hear a voice that was entirely her own. Lauren kept showing up to the dinners. She kept appearing at the events. She kept standing in photographs in which she was not the subject and accepting the captions in which she was not the name. She had long practice at accepting the terms offered without demanding the terms she might have preferred. What she was building through those years in the Kennedy orbit was not a social position or a network or a credential. Those accumulated without her trying. What she was building more quietly and with less guarantee of success was the ability to remain herself inside a world that was continuously pressuring her, through no one's deliberate intention, to become primarily a supporting character in someone else's story. She had not yet entirely failed at this, but the pressure was steady, and the story was not hers to direct. There is a particular kind of erasure that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with the drama of exclusion or the clarity of rejection. It accumulates instead through small omissions. The profile that is never written, the interview that is never requested, the photograph that is taken but not printed, the name that appears in sentences whose subjects are other people. It is the erasure of irrelevance, which is a strange word to apply to someone who is, by any objective measure, not irrelevant at all. But relevance in the world that Lauren Bessette inhabited was not determined by objective measures. It was determined by the press, by the social machinery that decided which lives were worth documenting and which were worth mentioning only in relation to lives that were. By the late 1990s, Lauren Bessette had been a vice president at Morgan Stanley for several years. She had built a career of genuine substance in an industry that did not make such careers available to people without substance. She had a professional reputation, documented in the memories of colleagues, in the trajectory of her promotions, in the trust extended to her by clients who could have gone elsewhere and chose not to. She had friendships that mattered, a private life that she had maintained with considerable effort against the pressure of circumstances that could have flattened it entirely. She was 34 years old. She was, by the accounts of people who knew her, at a stage where the shape of a life begins to become visible, where the choices of the preceding decades start to cohere into something that can be recognized as a person's particular way of being in the world. None of this was recorded anywhere that the public could access. There were no profiles of Lauren Bessette in the magazines that profiled people like her. The women's publications, the business press, the New York social pages that documented the lives of people who existed at the intersection of finance and a certain kind of Manhattan visibility. She had given no interviews. She had made no statements. She appeared in photographs almost exclusively as a supporting figure. Present at events, standing near her sister, identified by her relation to Carolyn and her position at Morgan Stanley, and nothing else. This was partly by choice. Lauren's disposition toward privacy was real and consistent and preceded the Kennedy years. She had never been someone who sought documentation. She had never believed that visibility was the same as significance, or that being seen by a large number of people was a meaningful measure of a life's worth. The Greenwich Formation, the Wall Street years, the sustained experience of watching what public attention did to her sister, all of it had reinforced a deep preference for operating below the threshold of that kind of interest. But preference and outcome are different things. Lauren preferred privacy because she had concluded, through observation and experience, that publicity was corrosive to the things she valued most: her actual relationships, her professional credibility, the specific quality of a life conducted on its own terms rather than on the terms that visibility imposed. This was a reasoned preference, not a fearful one. She was not hiding. She was simply declining to perform. The outcome, however, was that the record of her life, the archive from which any future account of her would have to be assembled, was almost entirely empty. What existed were the mentions, the parentheticals, the captions. What did not exist were her own words about her own life, her own account of the choices she had made and the reasons she had made them, her own description of what it had been like to grow up beside Carolyn, to build a career on Wall Street in the 1990s, to be pulled into the Kennedy orbit and to maintain, inside that pulling, some version of herself that was not reducible to the connection. She had never been asked. This is the more uncomfortable truth beneath the absence. The publications that might have profiled her did not, because the story they would have been telling was not, in their calculation, sufficiently interesting on its own terms. A woman vice president at Morgan Stanley with a compelling family background and a nuanced interior life was not, in the late 1990s, the kind of story that generated the numbers required to justify the space. Carolyn Bessette Kennedy was that story. John Kennedy Jr. was that story. Lauren Bessette was the sister, the parenthetical, the figure in the background of the photograph. The cruelty of this is not that the publications were wrong, exactly, by the standards of their own logic. The cruelty is that the standards of their own logic produced an outcome that erased a real person from the record, while she was still alive to notice it. Whether Lauren noticed it, whether she felt the erasure as erasure, or whether her commitment to privacy was sufficient insulation against the specific sting of being overlooked, is not something the record can answer. The people who knew her described someone who did not spend visible energy on resentment, who did not make her own invisibility into a complaint or a grievance. She was not performing contentment. She was, by most accounts, genuinely focused on the things she found meaningful. The work, the friendships, the sustained effort to be present for Carolyn in whatever way Carolyn needed. But the absence of visible resentment is not the same as the absence of feeling. Lauren Bessette was precise about what she allowed to show. She had been precise about it since Greenwich. The interior and the exterior of her life had never been the same thing, and the gap between them had, over the years, become a kind of architecture, a structure she inhabited so naturally that it had stopped being a performance and become simply the shape of how she moved through the world. What was inside the structure in those final years is not fully knowable. The record does not go there. The record, almost by definition, cannot go to the places that people like Lauren Bessette, private, careful, disinclined to perform, actually inhabit. What the record offers instead is the outline, the shape of a life seen from the outside, which is the only angle from which it was ever documented. A woman who existed, who mattered to the people who knew her, who built something real in a world that was not designed to make building easy, and who left almost no account of how any of it felt. The summer of 1999 arrived in New York with the particular heaviness that the city produces in July. The heat settling into the streets and staying there, the air thick with the accumulated exhaust of a city that does not slow down regardless of temperature. People who could leave, left. The Hamptons filled, and Martha's Vineyard filled. The specific geography of where wealthy New Yorkers went in summer was itself a social map, a set of coordinates that indicated not just preference, but position, and the Vineyard, with its quieter money and its longer history of a certain kind of establishment comfort, was where the Kennedy world went. Lauren had plans for that summer that were her own. She had taken vacation time, something she did not do casually, because the culture of Morgan Stanley in that era did not treat vacation as a right so much as a concession extracted from the work by sustained negotiation. And she had organized it with the care she brought to everything she organized. She was 34 years old and in the middle of a professional life that showed no signs of plateauing, and a personal life that had, by the accounts of friends from that period, begun to open slightly. There were indications, not documented anywhere with specificity, but present in the retrospective accounts of people who knew her, that she was at a moment of some cautious possibility, that the life she had maintained at a certain careful distance from full investment was perhaps beginning to admit a slightly larger version of itself. The details of this are sparse because Lauren did not share details. What her friends from that summer describe is someone who seemed, in the weeks before July, slightly more present than usual, not different in any dramatic way, not transformed, just available, in some quality that was difficult to name, but that the people who loved her registered. Carolyn and Kennedy were also in a period of cautious effort. The therapy they had been attending together was continuing. The marriage had not resolved itself into either clear stability or clear dissolution. It remained in the effortful middle ground where two people are still trying, still making the daily choice to stay, still hoping that the trying will eventually produce something more durable than trying. Friends from that period described Kennedy as genuinely committed to the work of repairing what had frayed. They described Carolyn as wanting to believe that commitment and not entirely being able to. The invitation for the flight to Martha's Vineyard came from Carolyn. She and Kennedy were going to attend the wedding of his cousin Rory Kennedy on July 17th. They were flying up on the evening of the 16th, which would give them time to arrive, settle, and be present for the family event the following day. Carolyn asked Lauren to come. This is a simple fact, and an important one. Lauren was not the original plan. The original plan had included a friend named Carol Radziwill, who had been expected to accompany Carolyn on the flight, but who, in the days before, had made other arrangements. Lauren stepped in. This is entirely consistent with everything known about her, that she would have said yes without deliberation, that being useful to Carolyn, being present when presence was requested, was not something she needed to think about. She adjusted her own plans. She cleared whatever was on her calendar for that weekend and made herself available. This is not remarkable in the context of who Lauren Bessette was. It is only remarkable in retrospect, in the way that ordinary decisions become unbearable when you know what follows them. She arrived at Essex County Airport in Caldwell, New Jersey on the evening of July 16th. The flight was delayed, not dramatically, but by several hours for reasons that were partly logistical and partly related to the haze that had settled over the eastern seaboard that evening. The visibility was not zero. It was not a night on which an experienced instrument-rated pilot would have declined to fly. But Kennedy was not yet instrument-rated, which meant he was flying in conditions that required visual reference to the ground and horizon, conditions that the haze that evening made more difficult than they appeared from the ground. The Federal Aviation Administration records from that night describe visibility that was technically adequate and practically treacherous. The kind of gradual deterioration that does not announce itself, that presents itself as manageable until it is not. Several pilots who flew similar routes that evening reported disorientation. One diverted. Kennedy did not divert. The three of them, John, Carolyn, Lauren, boarded the Piper Saratoga sometime after 9 o'clock. The flight to Martha's Vineyard, under normal conditions, takes approximately 40 minutes. They would have expected to land before 10, to be on the island in time for a quiet evening before the next day's wedding. The last radar contact with the aircraft was recorded at 9:40 p.m., approximately 7 miles southwest of Gayhead on Martha's Vineyard. The plane was at 2,200 feet and descending. The descent rate accelerated in the final moments, a pattern consistent with spatial disorientation, with a pilot who has lost reference to the horizon and cannot, in the darkness and the haze, reconstruct it quickly enough. The wreckage was found on the ocean floor, 116 feet below the surface, approximately 7.5 miles from the vineyard shore. It was found on July the 21st, 5 days after the crash, after a search that had become a national news event within hours of the plane's failure to arrive. Lauren's body was recovered with Carolyn's. They were found in the rear of the plane, together, which is what the seating arrangement would have produced and which the subsequent coverage noted in passing, in sentences whose primary subject was always Kennedy, the summer she had planned. Whatever it had contained, whatever cautious possibility it had held, ended in 116 feet of water off the Massachusetts coast on a Friday night in July. The work she had built did not end with her. The friendships did not end. The people who loved her did not end. But she was gone, and the world that recorded such things was already moving to decide what her absence meant. And in that decision she was going to be, once again, not quite the subject. The search began before most people knew there was anything to search for. Kennedy had filed a flight plan but had not activated it, a decision that was not unusual and not illegal, but that meant the formal machinery of air traffic control was not tracking the aircraft in the way it would have been had the plan been active. The Vineyard Airport had been expecting the plane. When it did not arrive by the time it should have arrived, the people waiting, a Kennedy cousin who had come to pick them up, waited longer and then began making calls. And then the calls reached people who understood what the absence of that particular aircraft meant in terms of what would happen next. The Coast Guard was notified in the early hours of July 17th. The search that followed was the largest aviation search and rescue operation in the history of the Coast Guard's 1st District. This is a specific, documented fact, and it is worth pausing on. Not to note the resources devoted to finding Kennedy, which is what most coverage did, but to note what those resources indicate about the nature of the event as it was understood from the first hours. This was not a missing persons case. It was not a search for 3 ordinary people who had failed to arrive where they were expected. It was a national event before the wreckage was found, before anyone knew with certainty what had happened, because one of the 3 people on the aircraft was John F. Kennedy, Jr. The coverage began almost immediately. By Saturday morning, the networks were running continuous updates. The footage was largely the same footage repeated: the ocean, the boats, the official statements from Coast Guard spokesmen who were careful and precise about what was known and what was not. The Chirons identified the missing as Kennedy, his wife Carolyn Bessette Kennedy, and her sister Lauren Bessette. In that order, in that hierarchy. The Bessette family, William Bessette, Anne Freeman, Lisa Bessette, learned what had happened in the way that families in such situations learn things, through phone calls, through the managed information flow of officials who have protocols for delivering news that has not yet been officially confirmed, through the particular horror of watching a private catastrophe become a public spectacle before you have had time to process that It is a catastrophe at all. They were not the primary family in the coverage. The Kennedy infrastructure, the extended family, the advisors, the institutional apparatus that had been managing the family's public presence since 1960, moved with a speed and a coherence that the Bessettes, who were not a dynasty and did not have that infrastructure, could not match. The statements released to the press in those first days were Kennedy statements. The grief being managed publicly was Kennedy grief. The Bessette family's grief was real and total, and almost entirely private, which meant almost entirely invisible. Anne Freeman, Lauren and Carolyn's mother, did not give interviews. She did not appear in the press coverage in any significant way. She was a woman who had lost 2 daughters, both of them in a single night, in the same aircraft, at the same moment. And she processed that loss away from cameras, which the cameras interpreted as an absence and moved on from quickly. The search continued for 5 days. The ocean floor off Martha's Vineyard was searched methodically, with equipment that could image the bottom at the depths where the wreckage was expected to be. Navy divers were deployed. The search was funded by the federal government, a decision that was not made for all missing aircraft, and that was made for this one because of who was on it, a fact that was noted by some observers at the time, and then set aside because the noting of it felt, in the atmosphere of national mourning that had already descended, like the wrong kind of observation. The wreckage was located on July 21st. The bodies were recovered over the following 2 days. Kennedy was recovered first. Carolyn was recovered alongside Lauren in the rear of the fuselage, which is where the seating arrangement had placed them for the 40-minute flight that became something else. The formal identification was made. The families were notified through whatever private channel the authorities used for such notifications, and then the coverage, which had been building for 5 days toward this moment, reached the pitch that live television reaches when the thing it has been anticipating is finally confirmed. The memorial service for Kennedy was held at sea aboard the USS Briscoe, a Navy destroyer deployed for the purpose. His ashes and Carolyn's ashes were scattered together in the Atlantic. Lauren's ashes were returned to her family. This is a simple logistical fact, and it contains within it the entire structure of the event as the world processed it. Kennedy and Carolyn were committed to the ocean together in a ceremony conducted by the United States Navy, attended by members of the Kennedy family, covered by cameras on nearby boats whose footage ran on every network. Lauren's remains went home with the people who loved her. There was no Navy destroyer, there was no national broadcast. There was a family, and a grief that was theirs alone, and a daughter and sister who had been on the same flight and died at the same moment, and was mourned in a register so different from the mourning that surrounded her that the 2 events barely seemed connected. The memorial service the Bessette family held was private. The details of it are not in the public record because the family chose not to make them public, which was entirely consistent with who the Bessette women were, with what Lauren had modeled in her own life, with what Carolyn had tried unsuccessfully to maintain against the pressure of the Kennedy visibility. In death, Lauren achieved the privacy she had always sought in life. The tragedy of it is that she achieved it not as a choice, but as a consequence, not because she had successfully protected herself from the machinery of public attention, but because that machinery had simply looked at her absence and decided to look elsewhere. The coverage moved on. It had other things to document: the Kennedy estate, the disposition of George Magazine, the question of what happened now, to the last chapter of the Kennedy legacy. These were the stories. Lauren Bessette's absence from them was not a decision. It was simply what happened when the cameras turned and found, in the direction where she had been, nothing they had been trained to see. Grief, when it occurs inside a public event, does not distribute itself evenly. It follows the same logic as attention, pooling around the most famous name, the most recognizable face, the loss that the largest number of people feel they have a personal claim to. The people who actually knew the dead, who loved them in the specific and irreplaceable way that proximity produces, find themselves grieving inside a noise that is about something adjacent to their grief, but not identical to it. The public mourning and the private mourning occupy the same moment in time, and almost no shared emotional space. The death of John F. Kennedy Jr. produced a public mourning of a scale and intensity that was, by most measures, without parallel in the decade. People gathered outside the Tribeca apartment on North Moore Street and left flowers and photographs and handwritten notes. The vigil was spontaneous and sustained and entirely genuine. These were people who felt, with a sincerity that cannot be dismissed, that they had lost something. Kennedy had represented something to the country that went beyond his actual life, had carried the weight of a national mythology about youth and promise and the specific American grief of Dallas, and his death at 38 renewed and concentrated all of it. Carolyn was mourned inside that morning, as his wife, as the woman who had stood beside him, as a figure who had herself become a kind of cultural presence through the years of being photographed and watched and discussed. The flowers at the apartment building included flowers for her. The notes mentioned her. She was not absent from the public grief. She was present in it as she had been present in the coverage, in relation to Kennedy. As part of his story, as the person who had been with him, Lauren was mentioned. She appeared in the news coverage as the third person on the aircraft, Carolyn's sister, the Morgan Stanley vice president. In the first days, when the search was ongoing and the three names were repeated with each update, she was part of the sentence. When the coverage shifted from the search to the mourning to the retrospective, when the television specials and the magazine tributes began to assemble the meaning of the event, Lauren receded. The tributes were about Kennedy. The retrospectives were about Kennedy, and adjacently, about Carolyn. Lauren was in the captions, in the subordinate clauses, in the third position of lists that began with two names that the audience already knew. The friends who had known Lauren, her colleagues from Morgan Stanley, the people from her own life who had nothing to do with the Kennedy world, were grieving someone specific. They were grieving the Lauren who had remembered their birthdays and kept their confidences and prepared for everything and showed up when she said she would show up. They were grieving someone who had been to them primary. Not a supporting figure, not a sister, not an appendage to a famous name, but the actual center of whatever relationship they had held with her. Their grief had no public space. The public space was full. It was occupied by a mourning that was genuine, but that did not have room, in its scale and its focus, for the particular loss of Carolyn Bessette as Carolyn Bessette. They attended no national memorial. They watched from the private space of their own loss the Navy destroyer and the ashes scattered at sea and the coverage that continued for weeks, and they held their own grief alongside it without the relief that public acknowledgement provides. This is the specific cruelty of dying inside someone else's event. It is not that the world does not mourn. It is that the world mourns something that includes you only incidentally, and the people who mourn you specifically are left to do it alone, in a moment that the culture has claimed for a different purpose. Anne Freeman, Lauren and Carolyn's mother, had lost both of her daughters on the same night. This fact, stated plainly without elaboration, is among the most devastating in the entire record of this event, and it was treated, in the coverage, as a detail, a paragraph, a sentence in the stories about the Kennedy family's grief, which was the grief the coverage was organized around. The Bessette family's loss was acknowledged and then set aside, because the story the coverage was telling did not have space for the full weight of what had happened to them. The particular shape of Anne Freeman's grief in the months that followed is not documented anywhere accessible. She did not give interviews. She did not appear in the retrospective coverage. She was a woman who had lost two daughters, not one, two, and she was doing whatever a person does with that in private, without cameras, without the particular comfort and complication of public acknowledgement. The friends who had known Lauren reported in the years after a specific experience of loss that was tangled with a specific experience of invisibility. Their mourning was real, and their mourning was private, and their mourning existed in a cultural context that was mourning something adjacent to it loudly and continuously, and the disjunction between the two produced a kind of grief that had no name and no community and no shared language to work through. They had loved Lauren. They had known her in the way that people who have been trusted by someone private know them. Not from the outside, not from the photographs and the captions, but from the inside, from the version of herself that Lauren kept behind the composure and offered only to the people she had decided to trust. That Lauren, warm and uncertain, and intensely loyal and quietly sad about things she did not name, was the Lauren they were grieving. And she did not appear in any of the coverage. She could not. She had never been in the coverage. The memorial the Bessette family held for Lauren and Carolyn was attended by the people who had actually known them. It was not photographed. It was not reported on. It happened in the private register that Lauren had always preferred, which meant it happened in the only way that genuinely honored who she had been. And then it was over, and the public mourning continued around it, and the world moved on to the next thing the coverage required of it. And Lauren Bessette remained where she had always been, present to the people who loved her, invisible to everyone else. The offices of Morgan Stanley in the late 1990s operated according to a rhythm that left little room for the kind of reflection that loss requires. The work continued. The markets continued. The clients continued. The particular culture of a major Wall Street firm in that era was not equipped to accommodate grief in any sustained way. It could pause, briefly, acknowledge the loss of a colleague with the language that institutions use for such acknowledgments, and then return to the work, because the work was the primary language, and everything else was, in the institution's implicit understanding, secondary to it. Lauren's colleagues paused. They acknowledged. They returned to the work. But the people who had actually known her, who had worked alongside her for years, who had been in the conference rooms and the late nights, and the particular crucible of a demanding professional environment that reveals character more reliably than almost any other context, carried something with them that did not resolve into the institutional acknowledgement and did not disappear when the markets reopened on Monday. What they carried was a specific person, not a name, not a position, not the vice president at Morgan Stanley who had died in the Kennedy plane crash. The Lauren who had shown up to the 8 o'clock meeting already having read everything anyone else was planning to read in the meeting. The Lauren who had told a junior analyst at 11 o'clock on a Wednesday night when the work was not going well that the mistake was fixable and that they should go home and fix it tomorrow when they could think clearly. The Lauren who had a way of listening in conversations, a quality of attention that was complete and unperformed, that made the person talking to her feel that what they were saying was the only thing in the room that mattered. These are small things. They are the kind of things that do not appear in obituaries or appear only in the compressed and slightly formal language that obituaries use for character. She was known for her warmth. Colleagues remember her dedication. The compression is inevitable. The compression is also a form of loss because the actual texture of a person, the specific way they occupied space, the particular quality of their attention, the small repeated gestures through which character is actually expressed, does not survive compression. The colleagues who spoke about Lauren in the years after, in the limited number of accounts that exist, in interviews that were peripheral to larger pieces about the crash or about Carolyn or about Kennedy, spoke about her in the language of the particular rather than the general. They did not describe a type. They described someone they had known. Someone whose absence was felt not as the loss of a position or a professional asset, but as the loss of a specific person who had been in the room and was no longer in the room. Several of them noted the same quality: the composure, the absolute reliability, the sense that Lauren had decided what she was going to do and then did it without complaint and without the need for acknowledgement that some of their other colleagues required. One described her as someone who made the work feel serious in the best sense, not heavy, not joyless, but genuinely consequential, conducted with a care that implied the outcomes mattered. Another noted that she had never heard Lauren speak disparagingly about a client or a colleague in a way that was purely social, the kind of casual professional cruelty that was not uncommon in that environment. Lauren had opinions. She expressed them directly when expression was warranted. She did not traffic in the currency of other people's diminishment. What the workplace accounts do not provide, what they cannot provide, because the workplace was not the place where Lauren allowed herself to be fully known, is a sense of her interior. The professional Lauren and the private Lauren were, by all accounts, genuinely continuous rather than contradictory. She was not performing competence at work and collapsing at home. But the professional Lauren was a contained and carefully managed version of the full person, the version appropriate to that context. And the colleagues who knew that version knew it well without knowing everything it contained. The people from her personal life, the friends who had known her outside the office, who had been present for the quieter and less managed versions of herself, describe someone who was, in those contexts, noticeably different in degree, if not in kind, warmer in a way that was less careful, more willing to be uncertain, more willing to want things openly, to admit to preferences and hopes in ways that the professional Lauren kept tightly regulated. She laughed differently with friends, one person noted without elaborating, as though the observation was self-evident to anyone who had known both versions. The people from her Greenwich years, those who had known her before Wall Street, before New York, before the Kennedy connection had reorganized the social landscape around her, describe someone who was recognizably the same person throughout, but who had, through the years, developed an increasing capacity for self-containment that read from the outside as self-sufficiency and was perhaps, from the inside, something more complicated. She had not, by any account, become someone who did not need people. She had become someone who had learned to manage how much she needed them, and to manage the expression of that need with such precision that it was difficult, even for people who cared about her, to know exactly what she required and when. This is not a character flaw. It is a characteristic produced by a specific history, by a childhood in a place that valued performance over interiority, by a career in an environment that treated vulnerability as liability, by a decade of watching what happened to people who allowed their private selves to become public property. She had protected herself well. The protection had also kept people at a specific distance, even the people she trusted most. What her colleagues remembered, and what her friends remembered, and what the partial and fragmented record of her life makes available is the outline of a person who was genuinely worth knowing, who had built something real, who had mattered to real people, who had moved through difficult environments with a grace that was entirely her own. They remembered someone specific. The world that remembered Kennedy remembered an icon. The world that remembered Lauren remembered a person. That distinction is not incidental. It is the entire difference between being famous and being known. The weeks that followed the recovery of the bodies were, for the Bessette family, a period of managing a private catastrophe inside a public event that would not conclude. The Kennedy machinery, the estate, the legal apparatus, the advisors and representatives who had been managing the family's public presence for decades, moved through the aftermath with the efficiency of an institution that had done this before, that had protocols for exactly this kind of loss, and the resources to execute those protocols without visible strain. The Bessettes had none of that. They had their grief, and they had each other, and they had the particular burden of processing an unsurvivable loss, while the world processed something adjacent to it loudly and without asking their permission. Anne Freeman did not speak to the press. This was consistent with who she was, a private woman who had raised daughters in whom privacy was a value, who had not sought visibility during the Kennedy years and did not seek it now. But her silence was also in part a necessity. There was nothing she could have said that the coverage would have received on its own terms. Any statement she made would have been processed through the lens of the Kennedy story, filtered through the question of what it meant for the Kennedy family, contextualized within the larger narrative that the press had already decided it was telling. She understood this or felt it, and she said nothing. Lisa Bessette, Lauren and Carolyn's older sister, was similarly private. She existed in the public record only as a name, a third Bessette daughter, who appeared in sentences that listed the immediate family members and then moved on. She gave no interviews. She made no public statements. She attended whatever private observances the family held and conducted her grief in the space that privacy provided, which was the only space available to her that the cameras had not claimed. The legal aftermath was complicated in ways that added a specific kind of institutional pressure to the family's grief. Kennedy's estate was substantial. The question of how it would be distributed, the properties, the personal effects, the financial holdings, was a matter of legal proceeding that involved the Kennedy family's attorneys and the representatives of all three estates simultaneously. Lauren's estate was relatively straightforward, by comparison. She had her Morgan Stanley assets, her apartment, the accumulated evidence of a professional life conducted with financial discipline. The assets were distributed according to her will, which was a private document, the specifics of which are not part of the public record. What the legal proceedings produced for the Bessette family was a sustained engagement with the institutional apparatus of the Kennedy world, at the precise moment when what they needed most was to be left alone with their loss. Attorneys required responses, documents required signatures. The administration of an estate is relentless in its demand for attention, and the administration of an estate that was entangled with a Kennedy estate was more relentless still, because the Kennedy estate was being managed with a level of legal sophistication and institutional momentum that the Bessettes were not positioned to match. Richard Freeman, Anne's husband and the stepfather who had been present in Lauren and Carolyn's lives since their adolescence, was present throughout this period in the way that the surviving members of a family are present, holding things together at the practical level, managing what could be managed, absorbing what could not be absorbed, and simply continuing anyway. The accounts that exist from people who knew the family in this period describe a household in grief that was also in the business of continuing to exist, which is what households in grief are required to do, regardless of what the grief demands. The Kennedy Foundation and the various Kennedy institutional structures that moved through the aftermath of the crash were not, by any account, hostile to the Bessette family. But they were organized around a center that was not the Bessette family and the Bessette family's interests, their privacy, their grief, their need to mourn their daughters and sisters without those daughters and sisters being continuously returned to the Kennedy story, were not the primary organizing principle of the institutions moving through the space. George magazine folded in 2001, 2 years after Kennedy's death. The magazine had been his project, his professional identity, the thing he had built that was most clearly his own rather than inherited. Its closure was treated as a cultural moment. Another ending in a decade of Kennedy endings. Lauren had had no connection to the magazine. She had existed, professionally and personally, entirely outside of it. Its closure did not directly affect her legacy or her family, and yet the coverage of George's closure mentioned her. In the reconstruction of the crash, in the summary of what had been lost, in the by now familiar list of names and positions and relations that the coverage used to locate the event in its historical context. She appeared once again in a sentence about something else. The Bessette family moved through the years that followed with a privacy that was partly chosen and partly imposed. They were not, in the calculation of the press, the subject of the ongoing Kennedy story, which meant they were left alone in ways that the Kennedy family, whose grief was itself a matter of public record and public interest, was not. This was, in some sense, a mercy. The coverage that would have attended a public Bessette grief would have been coverage that processed their loss through the Kennedy frame, that asked them questions whose real subject was not Lauren or Carolyn, but John, that reduced their daughters and sisters to the role those daughters and sisters had played in the story the press was actually interested in telling. The privacy protected them from that. It also meant that the grief was entirely theirs to carry, unwitnessed, unacknowledged by the culture that had been present for everything else, conducted in the silence that follows when the cameras leave and the coverage moves on and the people who remain are the ones who loved the dead for reasons that had nothing to do with why the cameras came. Anne Freeman had 2 daughters. She lost them both on the same night in the same aircraft for the same reason. The world knows this fact. It has known it since July 1999. It has not, in the quarter century since, spent much time sitting with what that fact actually means for the woman who carried it. The cameras had moved on. There was always something else to cover. 25 years after the crash, the archive of Lauren Bessette's life remains almost entirely empty. This is not a figure of speech. It is a literal description of what exists when you look. The newspaper databases return her name in thousands of articles, and in almost every one of them she appears in the same position, third in a list, subordinate clause, parenthetical identification. The photographs that exist of her are, with very few exceptions, photographs taken at events where she was not the subject. She is in the frame. She is not the frame's reason for existing. The interviews she gave number in the accessible public record at 0. The profiles written about her, as her, about her own life and her own choices and her own particular way of moving through the world also number at zero. What the databases return when you search her name is a record of an absence that accumulated in real time. Not after her death, but during her life, through the years when she was alive and working and present, and simply not the person the press had decided to document. This is worth distinguishing from the erasure that sometimes follows death, the deliberate or neglectful omission of a person from the historical record after they are no longer alive to advocate for their own inclusion. Lauren's erasure preceded her death. It was produced not by malice and not by oversight, but by the structural logic of a media environment that allocated documentation according to fame and allocated fame according to criteria that Carolyn Bessette did not meet and had not tried to meet. She was not famous. She was significant. To the people who knew her, to the institution she had built her career within, to the family that loved her. But significance and fame are different currencies, and the archive runs on fame. The archive is, in this sense, not a record of what mattered. It is a record of what was visible. And visibility in the late 20th century American media environment was a function of who the cameras had decided to follow, which was a function of who the public had decided to care about, which was a function of a set of values and priorities that had very little to do with the actual substance of a life. The biographical treatments of the Kennedy crash have, in the 2.5 decades since, been extensive. Books have been written about Kennedy, about his childhood, his career, his relationship with Carolyn, his death, and its meaning for the American political mythology his family had constructed and inhabited since the early 1960s. Some of these books are serious and careful. Some of them are not. All of them are primarily about Kennedy, with Carolyn as a secondary figure and Lauren as a tertiary one. Carolyn has fared somewhat better than Lauren in the retrospective record. Not well, but better. The interest in her as a figure has grown in recent years, partly because of a renewed cultural attention to the women who were attached to famous men and whose own complexity was obscured by that attachment, partly because Carolyn's particular quality of presence, the composure, the style, the visible cost of living under that level of scrutiny, translates well into the retrospective lens that contemporary culture applies to women who suffered publicly and were not, at the time, treated with adequate seriousness. Several documentaries have engaged with her. Several substantial articles have attempted to recover something of who she actually was beneath the image that the tabloids constructed. Lauren has not received that attention. The retrospective reclamation that has partially rehabilitated Carolyn as a subject in her own right has not extended to Lauren, and the reason is not difficult to identify. Carolyn had the Kennedy connection and the cultural image and the particular quality of tragedy that the contemporary retrospective sensibility finds legible. Lauren had a career at Morgan Stanley and a private life and a sister who was more famous than she was. These are not, in the calculation of documentary filmmakers or magazine editors, the ingredients of a compelling retrospective subject. This is the archive problem in its clearest form. The criteria that determine who gets documented retroactively are not fundamentally different from the criteria that determined who got documented in real time. Fame, visual iconography, connection to a larger narrative, the availability of material, photographs, interviews, public statements that can be assembled into a portrait. Lauren fails most of these criteria for the same reason she failed them during her lifetime. She was private. She was not visually iconic in the sense that the press iconicizes people. She was connected to a larger narrative, but as a supporting figure. And the material is sparse because the material was always sparse. The archive problem is also a philosophical problem. What the absence of documentation produces in Lauren's case is not simply a gap in the historical record. It produces a situation in which any attempt to recover her, to write about her, to make a film about her, to treat her life as something worth examining on its own terms, must work from the margins, from the parentheticals, from the accounts of people who knew her and whose memories are the primary resource available. This is difficult work. It is also, by its nature, incomplete work. The Carolyn Bessette that any retrospective account can recover is necessarily a partial Lauren, assembled from fragments, from absence, from what can be inferred from the outline, when the interior is not available. The people who knew her carry the complete version. They carry the specific Lauren, the one with the particular quality of attention, the precise and careful warmth, the self-containment that was both a protection and perhaps a cost. They carry the version of her that the archive cannot hold because the archive never had access to it. When those people are gone, that version will be gone with them. What will remain is the outline, the name in the sentence, the third position in the list. This is not a problem that can be solved. The archive is what it is. The record is what it was built to record, and it was not built to record Lauren Bessette. It was built to record the famous, the visible, the people who moved through the world in ways that the machinery of documentation found legible. Lauren moved through the world differently. She moved through it carefully, precisely, without demanding the documentation that the machinery required as a condition of preservation. She was, in this as in most things, consistent to the end with who she had always been. The archive held the outline. The people held the rest. There is a photograph that circulates occasionally in the retrospective coverage of the crash. Not frequently, but enough that it appears when you search long enough through the archive that exists. It was taken at some point during the Kennedy years, at an event whose specific occasion is not identified in any caption that accompanies it. Lauren is in the photograph. She is standing slightly to the side of the main grouping, composed in the way she was always composed, her attention directed somewhere outside the frame. She is not looking at the camera. She is not performing for it. She appears to be watching something, someone speaking perhaps, or a moment unfolding in the room around her, with the quality of attention that the people who knew her consistently describe. Complete, unperformed, present. The photograph is not about her. It was not taken for her. She appears in it the way she appeared in most of the record that exists, as a figure in a scene whose subject is something else, whose presence is real and visible and entirely incidental to the purpose of the image. It is, in a strange way, the most accurate document of her life that the archive contains. Not because it shows her accurately. A single photograph cannot show anyone accurately, but because the conditions of its existence replicate the conditions under which she lived. She is there. She is real. The camera happened to include her while looking at something else, and she is, characteristically, not looking back. 25 years is long enough for the shape of a life to become visible in ways that the life itself sometimes obscures. The people who knew Lauren Bessette are now in their 50s and 60s, at the stage where the distance from a loss is sufficient to allow something more than grief, where it becomes possible to think about who a person was not just in relation to their death, but in relation to their life, to ask what the life amounted to and what it meant and what it left behind. What Lauren left behind is not nothing. It is specific and real, even if it is not the kind of thing the archive records. She left behind people who were changed by knowing her, colleagues who absorbed, through years of working alongside her, a standard of professional seriousness that they carried into the subsequent decades of their careers, friends who were trusted by her and who understood from that experience what it felt like to be trusted completely and what it asked of them in return. A family that loved her with the specificity that only family produces, not the generalized affection of admiration, but the detailed, difficult, irreplaceable love of people who had known her since. Before she had constructed the version of herself she presented to the world, she left behind an absence in those people that is not diminished by the fact that the world does not know about it. Grief does not require an audience to be real. Loss does not become smaller because the cameras did not attend to it. Anne Freeman lost 2 daughters, and that loss is total and has remained total through every year that has followed, regardless of how the coverage distributed the mourning or how the Kennedy machinery organized the aftermath. The weight of it does not appear in the archive. The archive was not built to hold that kind of weight. Lauren Bessette also left behind a question that the archive cannot answer because the archive did not have access to the interior of her life. The question is whether the life she built, careful, disciplined, private, organized around the things she could control and the relationships she chose to invest in, was, in some final accounting, the life she had actually wanted, whether the self-containment was a satisfaction or a strategy, whether the deferred personal life represented a genuine preference for professional primacy or a long postponement that was still ongoing when the postponement ended. This question cannot be answered. It could not have been answered even if Lauren had survived. She was not someone who would have answered it directly, who would have offered that kind of access to anyone, except perhaps Carolyn, and Carolyn is also gone. The question sits in the record as a permanent open space, a gap that no amount of retrospective attention can close because the person who could have closed it is not available to do so. What the record does offer, assembled from the fragments that exist, is a portrait of someone who was more than the sum of the positions she occupied in other people's stories, who was, to the people who knew her, not a supporting figure at all, but a primary one, the center of their particular experience of her, the subject of their grief, the person whose absence left a specific and irreplaceable hole in their specific and irreplaceable lives. The world did not know her this way. The world knew her as the sister, the third name on the manifest, the vice president at Morgan Stanley, who died in the Kennedy crash. This is not wrong. It is simply partial, a fragment of a larger truth that the archive was never equipped to hold. She was 34 years old. She had been building something, professionally, personally, in the quiet and unwitnessed interior of a life that she had chosen to conduct away from the cameras. What that something would have become is not knowable. She did not have the time to find out, and the conditions of her death ensured that the world spent very little time wondering. The Piper Saratoga went down in 116 feet of water on a Friday night in July, and Lauren Bessette was in the rear of the plane, and she died alongside her sister and her brother-in-law, and the world mourned the event with an intensity that had almost nothing to do with her. Her name is in the record. It will remain in the record, attached to the Kennedy crash, attached to Carolyn's name, attached to the story that the world decided this event was about. What is not in the record is the person who bore the name, who showed up to work, prepared, who kept other people's confidences, who watched her sister with a vigilance born of love and could not, in the end, protect her from anything. Who was there at the edge of the photograph looking at something outside the frame? There is no estate bearing Lauren Bessette's name, no foundation, no endowed chair at a university, no wing of a hospital, no annual award given to young women in finance who demonstrate the particular combination of discipline and integrity that defined her professional life. The machinery that converts a famous death into a lasting institutional presence did not engage on her behalf, because that machinery runs on fame, and Lauren did not have fame. She had a life. The question that her story leaves open is not whether she was adequately mourned. Grief, as the people who loved her understood it, was never a public transaction. It is a quieter question than that. It is the question of what it means to move through a world that is continuously recording, continuously documenting, continuously assembling the archive of its own moment, and to do so in such a way that the recording misses you almost entirely. Not because you were absent, because the recording was pointed elsewhere. Lauren Bessette was pointed elsewhere too, away from the cameras, toward the work, toward the people she trusted, toward the version of a life that she had decided was worth building, even when the building was difficult, and the outcomes were uncertain, and the personal costs were real, and largely unacknowledged. She made that choice consistently, over many years, with a discipline that the people who witnessed it describe as genuine rather than performed. Whether it was enough, whether the life she built in the space the cameras did not occupy was sufficient for her, was what she had wanted, was the thing she would have continued building had the summer of 1999 been different, is a question that sits permanently unanswered in the record she left behind. What the record does hold is the outline. A woman from Greenwich who went to Wall Street and built something real. A sister who showed up when showing up was required and kept what she was told, and loved with a consistency that did not depend on acknowledgement. A person who existed, fully and specifically, in the lives of the people who knew her, and who exists now only in those lives. In the memories of colleagues who are aging, in the grief of a family that has carried its loss without an audience, in the partial and fragmentary archive that a private life leaves when the world was not watching. She was there, in the rear of the plane, on a Friday night in July. She was there long before that, in the offices, in the friendships, in the quiet and unrecorded dailiness of a life that mattered to real people in real ways. The camera did not follow her. She did not ask it to.